is Blake Bettinger, and I've been a genealogist for about 20, 25 years, and a genetic genealogist since I took my first test in 2003. So I blog about genetic genealogy, not as much as I should or as much as I used to, but I blog about genetic genealogy at thegeneticgenealogist.com. So I want to talk today about YDNA and mitochondrial DNA. And these are really the workhorses of DNA. When the first genetic genealogy tests were sold in 2000, they were YDNA and mitochondrial DNA tests. Now the newest entry has been autosomal DNA. So if you bought a recent test from 23andMe or Ancestry DNA or the Family Finder from Family Tree DNA, that's autosomal DNA. We're going to talk about,
how recent?
Within the last 4 or 5 years, or even more recently. So I'm going to talk tomorrow morning about autosomal DNA, but today we're going to talk only about YDNA and mitochondrial DNA. And let me ask by a show of hands, if you feel comfortable answering it, how many of you have either taken a mitochondrial DNA or yourself, or a YDNA for yourself, or a close family member? So. Excellent. A big percentage of the room. That's fantastic.
How would, I'm sorry, I don't know how do you tell? Like I took one from 23andMe. What is that?
That's an autosomal test. Now, so 23andMe, for example, only does autosomal DNA testing. Ancestry DNA, it's not tricky. You can't say only. So at the current time, Ancestry DNA only does autosomal DNA testing. There was a short period of time where Ancestry DNA was also doing YDNA and mitochondrial DNA. Family Tree DNA has done all of them. So Family Tree DNA right now, you can go and buy any of the DNA tests at Family Tree DNA. And in fact, what I'm talking about today, you can only do at Family Tree DNA and at Family Tree DNA. Now, you can buy some YDNA and mitochondrial DNA testing at other companies. I'm not going to talk about those at all today, and usually those are more specialized. But for this, if you're interested in what I'm talking about today, you're going to go and order a test from Family Tree DNA, because that's really the company that's offering this. Yes?
What about Ancestry.com?
That's all autosomal. And we'll talk about autosomal tomorrow morning.
Why did they drop it, the other two tests?
Autosomal, well, Ancestry DNA wanted to focus on autosomal. YDNA and mitochondrial DNA is more labor intensive, and so the profit margin isn't as high for YDNA and mitochondrial DNA. I mean, it's you focus on what you do best and what you can make the money on. Yes.
Can you give a quick explanation as to the differences between this?
Yep, you'll see it in the next 2 slides. Perfect lead in. I'll pay you that 20 later. So. All right, so there are 4 major types of DNA. And you can buy tests for 3 of these, and I'll show you what I mean. The first is YDNA, and this is one we're going to talk about today. What it is, who it looks at, and what you can use it for. Another type of DNA test is an xDNA test. Now you cannot go and buy your own xDNA test all by itself. Instead, you're buying it with an autosomal DNA test, and we'll see what that means in a minute. There's autosomal DNA, and then there's mitochondrial DNA. So we're only going to talk about YDNA and mitochondrial DNA. And this gives you an idea of what those are. No problem. No problem. So now these will be the focus of tomorrow morning. Autosomal DNA and xDNA. These are the focus of this afternoon. So if I could take all the DNA out from a cell and explode it into this big view with a microscope, this is what it would look like. And these are all the various types of DNA testing that are done. So first, there's the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is a very small round piece of DNA that's in the mitochondria. We'll talk more about that in the second half. And then there's the YDNA test. So for YDNA and mitochondrial DNA, that's the only piece of DNA we're looking at. Now, there's also xDNA. We're not going to talk about that today. And then there's all of this, which is all autosomal DNA. So you can see when you take a mitochondrial DNA test or a YDNA test, you're only looking at a tiny percentage of your actual DNA. And that's why autosomal DNA came along later to test all of what's in this this screen here to test all of this the remaining DNA that wasn't being tested. But again, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, YDNA testing. So YDNA testing is essentially looking at pieces or segments of the Y chromosome. And it's used for haplogroup determination, and we'll get into each of what these mean, surname studies, and to find or confirm or sometimes reject various relationships. So it has all of these various different uses. Now this is the key thing. What's nice about mitochondrial DNA and YDNA is you always know who you got it from. Even if you don't have a name on the chart, you know that where it came from. And let me show you why that is. Because a male always inherits the Y chromosome from his father. And so that means that you always know on your family tree where your particular YDNA came from. It came from your father's 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 father back through time. So I have the exact same Y chromosome as my father, my paternal grandfather, and so on back through time. So you're going to do two things. First, you will trace your YDNA back to see who you obtained it from, and then you may find an ancestor that you want to test. And in that case, you'll have to work forward. You'll have to find people walking around today that have the YDNA you're interested in. So let's say I want to find and test my great-grandfather's YDNA. Well, I'm going to trace down through time who he gave it to. Now we can already see right here, he had 2 sons. And so of course he gave his YDNA to his 2 sons. At the next generation, however, we see only this son passed it on. This son only had daughters. And then at the last generation, we have these 2 individuals. So we see this unbroken line of YDNA being passed down through the generations. Now, this other line has done what we called daughtering out. So this line has resulted in no YDNA at all being passed down in this line, just because every time there's a woman in the line, that breaks the YDNA. That'll be different from mitochondrial DNA, but for YDNA, anytime there's a woman in the line, it breaks that transmission. There's a couple of different YDNA tests. If you were to go and order a YDNA test right now, you're probably going to order an STR test. So these are short stretches of YDNA called short tandem repeats. Some people, and you'll probably have heard it referred to as markers. And what it is just a repetition of the same DNA sequence. What's nice about it is that we don't even care what the DNA sequence is. It doesn't matter to us. So for example, if the STR result is 7, you see there are 7 repeats of this DNA. This is the DNA strand. Those letters stand for nucleotides or base pairs, but we can essentially ignore that. We don't care about that. All the company does is family tree DNA goes in and counts those repeats, and it arrives at the final number of 7. So at that marker, your result is 7. And then you'll get all of these markers and your results. So DYS is the name of various markers. And you don't even care so much about what the name means or where it is. You just know that I have DYS 393, a value of 13. And my father will have a value of 13 because we have the same YDNA. So if you test a relative, they should have some of the same markers. What? It has to be a male, and it has to be related through an unbroken male line. So a male will have, that are closely related, will have the same markers. But as time goes on, what happens is DNA will sometimes accumulate mutations. And sometimes what happens is, instead of having 7 repeats here, what happens is when it's passed down to the next generation, there's 8. And then another generation, a few generations later, there's 9. And so these mutations can arise. That's why not everyone in this room has the same exact YDNA. Our YDNA has diverged at some point in history and gathered these mutations. So when you get the results, you're going to compare the numbers of 2 people. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. So when you get the results back from the company, you'll have other information as well. they'll use it to predict your YDNA haplogroup. And a haplogroup is just a group of related Y chromosomes that share a common ancestor. And generally, when we talk about this, we're talking about thousands of years ago. So this is not something that's going to help you fill in names and dates on your family tree. It's more about the ancient origins of your direct paternal line. Remember, out of 1,000 ancestors and 10 generations, we're talking about one person. Your father's 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 father. So this is an example of the haplogroup tree. So all of humanity, all male YDNA can fit somewhere within this haplogroup tree. And if you trace it back, you can see it all originates in Africa. So all YDNA branched out from Africa and has filled in the rest of the world here. My YDNA, for example, is R1b. And all R1b means is there is some information associated with that particular haplogroup, mainly that it's the most common Western European haplogroup. And it has origins a couple tens of thousands of years ago. Again, I'm not getting any names or dates. I just know that at some point my father's 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 father was Western European. And for me, that's not surprising. My ancestry is German on my paternal line. So that fits up in very, very well with what I expect. So that's one thing you get with your results. Another thing you can do with your results is essentially to fish for cousins. And essentially what this is doing is it's looking for YDNA that's similar to your YDNA. If I tested a company and someone has very similar YDNA to me, that means that we're closely related on our paternal lines at some point in history. And depending on how closely related we are, we might even be able to find a common ancestor on our paternal lines. What's nice about YDNA is that we always know what line we're talking about. It's always that paternal line. We'll see tomorrow with autosomal DNA, if you attend that lecture, that's where the problem with autosomal DNA comes from. We don't know what line we're talking about. YDNA is nice and neat and clean for the very reason that we always know what ancestor we're talking about. So here, these are examples of my matches with the names just blocked out here. My matches at Family Tree DNA. So when I test, I'll get a result of these individuals. These people have YDNA that's similar to my YDNA, meaning I share a common paternal ancestor with these individuals. Now you can see this first person here is a Bettinger. I specifically tested him because I knew we shared a paternal ancestor, and I wanted to see how closely our YDNA matched. And in fact, because our YDNA matched, that essentially confirms that my genealogical research on those lines is correct, which is a nice use of YDNA. The others, however, are more distantly related. And how do I know that? Because of this column right here, the genetic distance. The genetic distance tells me how many differences there are between his YDNA and my YDNA. Now, perfect match will be a genetic distance of 0. Myself and my father, for example, I would expect us to have a genetic distance of 0. But you can see with this individual, this is my 5th cousin, and we have a genetic distance of 2. So it's not surprising. In those generations, we've accumulated some differences in our YDNA. Now these other individuals, 6 and 7, those are big differences. And so it's very, very difficult to find the common ancestor for those people because it's probably beyond the scope of traditional research. It's beyond what we could figure out with paper records. And I wish there was a magic cutoff or you could apply a certain number of years, but it's sort of and you gather this with experience in a way. 2 is a good match. Now you can see how many markers am I comparing. Because if you buy a test, you can buy different markers. The default now, I believe, is 37 markers. But you can also order 67 markers. All it's doing is that's telling you the number of places on your YDNA it's testing. And generally, the more markers you test, the better information you're going to get. The better the resolution of the comparison. And let me show you what I mean. So this individual, and yes, I'll come back to that. I'll show you what I mean with the number of markers. So here, with this individual, I have a genetic distance of 2. So this might be an example of where that genetic distance of 2 comes from. This is a comparison of some of those 67 markers I was talking about. So you can see for this individual, there's a difference of a marker here and a marker here. This would be a genetic distance of 2, because there's 2 markers different. We differ by 1 in each of these 2 markers, and alleles is just another name for marker. And again, we don't care so much about what any of these mean or where they are along the Y chromosome. It doesn't matter to us. As long as we're comparing apples to apples, all that matters are the differences or similarities between the results we're comparing. This is a nice chart, and this is available at the Family Tree DNA Frequently Asked Questions. This gives you sort of a very, very general guide to the genetic distance. So remember, I tested 67 markers, and I tested my 5th cousin. We had a genetic distance of 2. That falls within this very related to related realm right here. Now, if I had a genetic distance of 2 and we had only tested 12 markers, that would tell us we're not closely related, because that's too much distance for those number of markers. So this gives you an idea of why that more markers is generally better, because you're getting more resolution or information about that genetic distance. Okay, so another thing that YDNA is very good for is answering genealogical questions, such as confirming and sometimes rejecting a hypothesis. Let me show you what I mean by that. So for example, I have the Bettinger surname. It's a very rare surname. There's one main family that's well documented, and then there's these other families that don't seem to tie in any way that we can find. And so the Bettinger project essentially asks one question: are all Bettinger males paternally related? Do we all have a single source of our YDNA, and therefore a single ancestry? So it's kind of a small and sad surname project. I don't know if any of you are members of Surname Project, but I haven't been too good on my recruiting goals here. But you can see here that, in fact, this is our haplogroup here. Remember I said that one of the pieces of information you'll get back is your haplogroup information. Well, actually, each of these individuals here, we'll look at the top 3, have different haplogroups. I can tell you, if you're in different haplogroups, you are not recently related. And for these individuals, they're related on the paternal line tens of thousands of years ago. So this gives me already, just with these individuals, a simple answer to my question. No, Bettingers are not all paternally related. We have different, the name arose in different places at different times. And in fact, these are about as different the lines as you can get here. So no paternal relationship between all Bettinger males. Now, one thing we could do is we could also get into the actual analysis. We could compare these markers to look at all the differences. And that might be necessary if we were in the same haplogroup, for example. These 2 individuals down here are much closer related. They're in the same rough haplogroup. So we could then compare these numbers to see what those look like. All right, so I want to give an example. This is my paternal line going back to Germany. And it just so happens, some of these individuals, these are the only pictures I have, and yet we're all wearing ties. I don't know how that worked out. I guess you get dressed up and dates for your picture. So Philip Bettinger, born in Germany, had 5 sons. And essentially I wanted to ask, can I test other descendants, other direct male line descendants, people who are walking the earth today with Philip Bettinger's YDNA, and compare them to myself to see if we match? I sort of already gave you the answer, but in fact, it does match. Now, first I tested us at 37 markers. Here for this picture, I've logged in as his account, and that's why you see me as his match here. This is 37 markers, meaning at this time we hadn't tested the maximum number of markers. Actually, the maximum is 111. I seldom go to 111, but I do like to test at 67 markers. You can see we had a genetic distance of 2 at 37 markers. That's okay. It's not a great match, but what happened is I then upgraded us to 67 markers, and we still stayed at 2 markers difference. So that tells us, that moved us from a so-so match into a very good match. It just so happened that the 2 that were different were in the 37 marker panel. So this gives you an example of why more information is sometimes better. So again, this is a very good confirmation that our research on our paternal lines is in fact correct. Okay, so let's say we have this hypothesis here. We have George and Chris. We're pretty sure they were brothers, but we don't know for sure. So what we want to do is, and George and Chris are both deceased, but they have descendants. They have Ronald and Caleb here. So what we can do is we can YDNA test Ronald and Caleb and see if they have the same YDNA. If George and Chris are brothers, and these two lines are unbroken, then Ronald and Caleb have to have the same YDNA. And so if we get back a result like this, where they're a perfect match, that would tell us, well, that looks very good that they were in fact, they were brothers. Now I'll note, that does not prove they were brothers. All it proves is that they were paternally related. So they could be, for example, first cousins, they could be father-son, they could be nephew, uncle, for example. We know they're related to their paternal lines, and recently, because these are still a perfect match, but we don't know exactly what their relationship is. With YDNA testing, you can never get the exact relationship of the individuals like that. It'll just tell you, were they paternally related or not. In a result like this, however, we're going to have to be much more careful. There's a genetic distance of this would work out to 3, so we take the difference, and the difference here, this is a big genetic distance. And so it doesn't look here like the two individuals were in fact brothers. Alright, so let's take another example of how we can use YDNA to ask or to examine a genealogical question. So who was the father of John Williams, born in Boston in 1689? Let's say we have these different 3 scenarios. And typically, if you're doing genealogical research, you probably have one of these as your hypothesis. Either you have absolutely no idea whatsoever. I've looked and looked and looked. I can't find a single person who might be John Williams' father. Let's say that you have 2 people. I'm pretty sure one of these 2 individuals were John Williams' father. And then I think there's another scenario where you're sure that person X was John Williams' father. It's just everyone's accepted it. There's been lots of research to establish that. You can use YDNA testing to test any of these situations. So let's take the first one. You have no idea whatsoever who the father could be. So you test someone that is walking around with John Williams' YDNA. And then you can compare that to other Williamses who have already tested. Now, it just so happens that the Williams Surname Project is one of the largest, if not the largest, surname project. If you're trying this with a Bettinger, I apologize right now because you're not going to get very far. But for the Williams Surname Project, you're going to be compared to 1,000+ people. And so what might happen then is you might be able to find one of those family groups, so they grouped it into 236 families, you might be able to find someone, a family group that you match more closely than the others. If that's the case, that's giving you clues about where you should be looking for John Williams' family.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Where did you find information about that?
If you go to Family Tree DNA, actually if you just Google whatever surname DNA project, or family, Bettinger Surname Project, for example, you'll come right to it. You can also go to the Family Tree DNA website and do a search there. They have something like, I think I just had 8,000 surname projects. Now, another benefit of joining a surname project is if you're planning on testing, go and join that surname project because you get a discount on testing. So there's a big benefit to joining surname projects. So let's say we have scenario number 2 here, where we have some candidates identified. We think it was either X or Y that was John Williams' father. So what we do is we can go and test descendants of X and Y and compare it to descendants of John Williams and do a comparison and say, which of those individuals does he match? If your hypothesis is correct, then he should match, the descendant of John Williams should match either the descendant of X or the descendant of Y. Unless you have the nightmare scenario where X and Y are paternally related, in which case that wouldn't work for this. So this is essentially what we have here, right? We have this descendant of John Williams, and then we have X and Y here. And we've tested those 3 individuals, and we're looking to see. In this scenario, there's no match, and there's a match here. That would lead you to think that Y over here is in fact John Williams' father. Again, it doesn't prove it, but it supports your hypothesis, and hopefully you have other evidence you can mix in with that to work on that. So then we have the third scenario, where you already know who the father is, you're just doing this to help the survey project or to confirm your research. So in this case, you'll test an individual, another descendant of that line, and compare them. And sometimes you're going to have a match, and sometimes you're not. Because unfortunately, there's this occurrence called a non-paternal event. It's kind of a misnomer because, in fact, there was a father, and it's not amazing. But another name for it is misattributed parentage. Now, sometimes it was the milkman, and sometimes it was just an adoption or a name change or something else that everyone knew about at the time, and it was no big deal, but just it wasn't part of the family story that got passed down. So sometimes this is a big surprise, and sometimes it's just a piece of history that was lost. But this is a good way to do this. And so sometimes you might want to confirm it. Now I'll note, just having this match here, that might not be enough in your head to confirm it. You might want to add a third person, but this is sort of a adding on evidence once you have it. And that might be something that's sort of optional for you to do. As I said before, DNA alone is never conclusive proof because you're always combining it with other pieces of evidence. Because, for example, a YDNA test can't tell whether two people were brothers or some other paternal relationship, you're going to have to bring in other pieces of evidence. So, for example, their ages is another piece of evidence. If they were the same age, well, they weren't father-son. They might even be uncle or nephew, however. Or if they were born too close together, they're not brothers. There's some other relationship. But you're slowly adding in pieces of information to the DNA. Now, another interesting use that people are using is to find their paternal name or their biological surname. So this is a test that's used all the time by adoptees in hopes of identifying matches that would point them towards their biological surname. And in fact, Family Tree DNA suggested as much as 30 to 40% of adoptees, male adoptees only of course, who test are able to identify a potential surname, which is really amazing. I think that's also promising. That tells you how valuable this is for genealogy, but it also tells you that adoptees are using these tests all the time. So for example, let's say we have this Riley Josephson. He's adopted. He has no information about his parents. He has some family tree up here, but he just doesn't know what it is. And then when he gets back this result, let's say that this is the pattern he's seeing. Well, this is strong evidence that his surname is Gates. His biological surname is Gates. So he can then pursue that in hopes of adding it to whatever information he may have, if he has anything, and finding a common ancestor. Now, does that mean that his name is definitively Gates? It doesn't mean that, no. Because it could be, for example, that there was some other break in the line. Maybe it's clear, probably, most likely, that his father was a Gates. That doesn't mean his father's surname was Gates. Maybe his father was adopted, or there was a break in the line. So this isn't definitive proof, but it's extremely powerful for adoptees who are trying to find their biological heritage. These are the, last time I checked, the current prices of YDNA testing, but these are the prices without having joined the surname project. So if you're going to do this test, I highly recommend you join a surname project first. Okay, that's a very brief introduction to YDNA. Very, very powerful. And mitochondrial DNA is also very powerful. Now, mitochondrial DNA is, yes?
Can I just ask a quick question? Clarification, YDNA is only for males?
Only males can take a YDNA test, yes. So if you're a woman interested in your paternal line, you have to find that male relative. And a lot of times, it's a brother or an uncle. And, yeah. Yes?
Is that surname project sponsored by Family Tree?
Yes, they actually host a lot of them as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
If you know that the DNA is directly from Europe, because the father was from Europe,
So, is that in the database, or is it only DNA from people?
Well, a lot of people in Europe have not tested. Europe has not embraced genetic genealogy to a big degree. However, because so many people that have tested in the United States have roots, and often recent roots in Europe, sometimes it's not uncommon to get good information by testing even so. Just because other people are essentially in the same boat, I guess that's sort of a pun, right? But they're in the same category and they have done that recent research. And if you make that magic connection, that can be really valuable. Yes?
I'm not the surname group administrator for the Horton surname project, but that's my surname and my brother's kid is in the test. I've worked with the administrator of the project to post a notice on the Horton surname project that I am willing to pay for YDNA testing of Horton surname man in Yorkshire.
Oh,
And so
interesting.
one man tested and got his results back. It was very, he's a group of one now.
Perfect. That's great.
The
Yeah.
second one, we're waiting for his results to come
Nice.
back.
And so,
But
yeah,
I'm going to do, I mean, it's an expensive, it becomes an expensive.
it does. Yes.
But I also get, I'm just impatient with some of the issues. And
Yeah.
like, cutting to the quick.
Right.
My Hortons came over in the 1600s.
Yeah, let me say that when I said not widely embraced in Europe, UK is sort of an exception to that. There is a lot of testing in the UK. Yeah. One more question.
Yeah, so really a female cannot do a surname test, they cannot get on that.
On themselves, no. But you can
Unless we can find.
paternal. Yeah. All right, so mitochondrial DNA test. And let me point out that I teach a lot of week-long courses on DNA, so fitting anything into an hour lecture is always such a challenge. So I know sometimes it feels like it's too much in an hour, and I can tell you I agree, but DNA is tough. That's why I recommend go to multiple lectures and you start to grab bits and pieces every time you add something new. So mitochondrial DNA, there's a couple of different tests, although at the current time, really at Family Tree DNA, they're only doing whole genome sequencing in the mitochondrial DNA test. In the early days of mitochondrial DNA, the tests were only looking at this tiny segment. You can see, however, that's not the vast majority of the mitochondrial DNA. So we want to look at all this information. So if you go and order a test today, I believe it's $199 last time I checked. That's the whole mitochondria. And you're going to see, for reasons in a moment, that you want to order that test because you need all of that information. So this is the mirror image. This is the mirror image of the YDNA. We get the mitochondrial DNA from our mother's 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 mother, for example. So if we trace it down through the family, for example, we have great-grandma here. Now this is the key point. Mothers pass down their mitochondria to both sons and daughters. That means everyone in this room has mitochondrial DNA and they can take a mitochondrial DNA test. The difference is, however, only women pass it on to the next generation. Men do not. So men represent a dead end to all mitochondrial DNA. But don't overlook them as a source of testing. Now, I'll often find people who say, I can't find anyone to do this mitochondrial DNA test, but they've overlooked that last person on Earth who has it is actually a male, so they can do that. It won't get passed on to the next generation, but don't overlook males as a potential source of testing. Just remember, they don't pass it on. So in this example, only the daughter passes it on. So these two males, if you were to test them, they would have that, but if they're deceased, you're out of luck. You have to go through this other line here. And then, of course, it gets passed down to the next generation. So YDNA, remember, women are a roadblock to YDNA. For mitochondrial DNA, men are a roadblock to mitochondrial DNA. When you get the results from Family Tree DNA, they're going to look like this. What they do is they compare your results to a standard called the Cambridge Reference Sequence, or CRS. You might see a little R in front of it. That just means it's been updated, the revised Cambridge Reference Sequence. The only thing that's special about it is that it's the first mitochondrial DNA that was ever sequenced in 1980 or thereabouts. So ever since 1980, every new mitochondrial DNA sequence that's been obtained has always been compared to that sequence. So these are my results, And these are my differences from that reference sequence. So these are what my results would look like. And again, I don't care so much about what they are or what they mean. What I care about is the comparison to other people. Because if I test my mother, for example, I expect her to have all of these same mutations. And that's what these are. These are mutations. These are differences from the Cambridge reference sequence. So there's always an association in people's minds that mutations are these bad things. But in fact, 99% of mutations are completely harmless and silent. So these mutations are all silent mutations that have just arisen in time. And when I compare close relatives, they'll have some or all of the same mutations. When I test very distant people, they will have a different set of mutations. So one thing family tree DNA will do for you is they will determine your mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. Remember, we had that nice YDNA haplogroup map where it all emanated out of Africa. We have the same thing for mitochondrial DNA. It traces back, of course, all to Africa, and then you can see it branches off. And for each one of these haplogroups, let's see, we have haplogroup H, U, X, T, all these various haplogroups are associated with a time and place. So, for example, T might be 30,000 years ago in Western Europe. And so when you get your haplogroup, is that fascinating information? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it's not helping you fill out your family tree at all. It's just telling you what are the ancient origins of your mother's 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 line. Another thing you can use mitochondrial DNA for is cousin fishing. So you're looking for relatives in the database. So family tree DNA, and I probably should update these numbers, it's been a couple months and they test so many people that the numbers have to be updated frequently. But they have close to 300,000, if not more, mitochondrial DNA records in their database. So when you test, you're being compared to 300,000 people who have tested their mitochondrial DNA. This interface will look very similar because it's very similar to the YDNA. And this is the important column. This is the genetic distance. This is telling you how many differences there are between your mitochondrial DNA and the other person's mitochondrial DNA. And the closer that number is to 0, the better the match is. Okay. The other thing that's nice about family tree DNA is your matches will have, if they populated, the most distant ancestor. And I recommend you put that in your own profile. Put in your most distant ancestor so that when people look at your results, they can see and see if they can make that quick connection. Now, this is actually these are my results. And you can see I have all of these perfect matches, all of these zeros for my mitochondrial DNA. And I have not found my common ancestor with a single one of them. And I'll tell you why that is. Now, if these were all zeros in my DNA, well, first of all, it would be pretty rare to see that unless you specifically tested close relatives. And that's because YDNA changes faster than mitochondrial DNA. So YDNA is very good at telling us the distance between two people. Mitochondrial DNA, however, is very stable. If you think about it, if something that is very stable was around 1,000 years ago, that means in the intervening 1,000 years, it's gone to lots of different people, and it's remained largely the same. So for example, I'm related to these individuals probably hundreds of years ago. And yet we still have identical mitochondrial DNA. So you can see that makes it very challenging. You get all these zero results and you get excited thinking, well, this is finally going to help me break through my maternal line, my mother's 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 line. And yet you get these results and they're all zeros and you can't find a common ancestor with a single one of them. So that isn't to say mitochondrial DNA isn't useful, because it really is. But it can be sometimes very difficult to find a common ancestor, even with perfect matches. So family tree DNA has an estimate that with a full sequence match, for example, there's about a 50% chance that you'll find a common ancestor within 5 generations. That's about 125 years. And so if you know, that's a nice chance, but it's very, very, I can tell you, it doesn't always work out that way. I seem to be the other 50% every time. But this also tells you why you should be doing full sequencing. You don't want to take the early test, which was this HBR1, HBR2, because there's a 50% likelihood you have a common ancestor within 25 generations. So finding an ancestor there would be impossible. With a full match, however, you're at least focusing on the matches that are the most informative, the greatest likelihood of finding a common ancestor. Mitochondrial DNA is very good for testing a hypothesis, just as we saw with YDNA. Let's say we have this scenario where Mary, Jane, and Prudence, you're convinced, were all sisters. They were living in the same house. It looks like they had the same parents. You're convinced they're sisters. So what do? Well, you find direct maternal descendants of these three sisters. When you test the descendants, they should all match, if they are, in fact, maternally related, and if they were sisters. So let's say we get the results back, and they look something like this. Well, I don't have the genetic distance number, but I do have this direct comparison. And you can see Mary's descendant and Prudence's descendant are identical matches. But Jane's descendant is not a perfect match to these two. Now I can tell you that was, that was 4 generations here. 4 or 5 generations. I can tell you we should not be accumulating 3 mutations in 4 or 5 generations. Does that mean it's absolutely impossible? Well, it doesn't unfortunately mean it's perfectly impossible. But this scenario is very, very unlikely. This weighs very strongly against your hypothesis. So your hypothesis, therefore, is either that there may have been, Jane may have been from another family that was living with them, or perhaps there was a break in this line that isn't documented. That doesn't happen nearly as much as the paternal line, because usually people know who the mother was. It's harder to hide that than and not know that compared to the male line. So that's a good way to use that. This is how I've used mitochondrial DNA testing. So my mitochondrial DNA line, my mother's 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 mother, goes back to the Cayman Islands in the early 1820s. And I had this brick wall. I have absolutely no information about this individual's ancestors. This is my maternal line back as far as I can go with pictures. And when I did a mitochondrial DNA test, I knew that these individuals were European missionaries to the Cayman Islands and to the Honduras, and so I expected to have a European mitochondrial haplogroup. However, what I found was I had a Native American haplogroup. So at some point, my mother's 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 mother was actually Native American, not European, as I had thought. Now, unfortunately, I don't have names and dates. My family tree is not suddenly filled out on my maternal line. However, I was effectively, I think of it as peeking past the brick wall. I know what happened back here, or I know what this maternal heritage is, but I don't have all of the answers yet. This tells me, though, where I should be looking, perhaps, which was an unexpected result. So as I said before, the full genome is $199, and I recommend, if you're doing mitochondrial DNA testing, definitely doing the mitochondrial. The price of this test has dropped so dramatically. When it first came out, I believe it was $999. When I bought it, I think it was $399. So it is fallen. Now it's held pretty stable at $199. Because there's a lot of expense in sequencing that full amount of DNA. But this is really it's come down incredibly. All right. So I want to give you a few examples of how people are using mitochondrial DNA and YDNA in their research. Yes?
I was just going to ask, does this give you any medical...
That's a very good question. So, in a tiny fraction of cases, the YDNA can sometimes potentially reveal a deletion on the Y chromosome that is associated with sterility. So, if you test your father and he has this result, that might be a shocking result. So, that's a tiny, tiny percentage of cases. For mitochondrial DNA, however, there is a greater likelihood that some of them can be associated with mitochondrial diseases. However, for the most part, by the time people are testing and they're in their adulthood, and those diseases would have been apparent already. So it's not generally that you can test your mitochondrial DNA and learn about some disease that you're likely to get in the future, because you would have already had this pretty severe mitochondrial DNA disease for the most part. So, but it can reveal some health information, so you have to be careful about that. Now, what I'll say is, however, your matches don't see your results. They don't see your raw data. They see your genetic distance. So all they see are the comparison between two people, unless you make that somehow public. Like, for example, joining a survey project or a Happy Root project, sometimes those mutations can be made public. So just be careful about what you're allowing if you're not comfortable with that. Just use whatever level of privacy you're comfortable with. Okay, this is my great-grandmother. And my great-grandmother was adopted. She died in 1983, born in 1889, had a long life. One of my earliest memories, actually, is meeting my great-grandmother. And I found her birth certificate, and I'm pretty sure that's not the father's real name, not known. I haven't run across that surname. Well, actually, I've run into that surname a lot, right? No, usually unknown. But so I don't know who her father was, and I'm even a little iffy on whether or not this is the mother's real name. So I need to use DNA testing to hopefully identify who her grandparents or who her parents were. So she had 2 children. This is Helen right here. She had 2 children, my grandfather and my great aunt. And they each had children. So if we follow the mitochondrial DNA line, we know that Helen had a certain mitochondrial DNA. And when we follow it down, what we find is, in fact, there's one person on Earth I know of that has Helen Johnson's mitochondrial DNA. And luckily, he was very gracious to take a mitochondrial DNA test. If he had been deceased, or if he had said no, I would have been out of luck. Because as far as I know, no one else has this mitochondrial DNA. It didn't go to my grandfather, because he's a male. And so he broke that line. But here, this son has that mitochondrial DNA. My hope is, if I test this mitochondrial DNA and compare it to the results, that we find a common ancestor. When I get the results back, I get a certain haplogroup. Unfortunately, these are the example I showed you earlier. I have a whole bunch of perfect genetic matches on my mitochondrial DNA. And this is even full sequence. And I have yet to find. Now, of course, I'm not really comparing anything, right? I'm essentially looking for a family who might have been in the right place at the right time, or may have been associated with that Johnson surname I have it for her mother's surname, potential surname. But I haven't found the common ancestor. So this tells you, again, mitochondrial DNA doesn't always give you all the answers, but when I find a candidate line, I can mitochondrial DNA test them to see if they match, if they should match that mitochondrial DNA, if in fact they are actually maternally related. So I have this piece of data that's waiting for somebody to come along and confirm it. And eventually I will give this talk and reveal the answer at the end, but I can't get there yet. Yes?
So you got back, you got back these results here, and what did you do to test whether any of these were?
Well, they're all perfect matches. Family Tree DNA reports that to me.
But you said none of them had any.
I had to just look. I had to look through any family trees they were willing to share. So, for example, you can see this blue marker, or purple, or whatever color it is. These people have family trees attached to their account. I actually can go and look directly. Right? I can just click on that right now. Otherwise, I have to contact these people and say, are you willing to share your maternal line? They do all have their most distant maternal ancestor listed here as well. So this person, most distant ancestor on the maternal line is this individual. So I can use that information just as a first glance. And then I can really dive in with asking them about.
And how did you rule them out? I mean, when you looked at those trees.
I can't rule any of them out, actually. No. All I can say is I don't know. It could be the answer's right here. I just don't know until I have more information. Yep. Yes?
Does anyone test teeth or hair for this purpose?
You know what? That's a great question. I get that all the time. No one is doing that at the current time. However, I think there is an enormous untapped market there. So I expect in a few years, when the technology gets better, that people will start doing that. I have envelopes from letters that my great-grandmother wrote and that I'm holding on to, and someday I will be able to test those. Yeah. And one more question about that. For family tree DNA, it's a cheap swab. Yep. This is Richard III. Richard III died in 1485 under some pretty tragic circumstances. He was in battle. I guess that's a good way for a king to go out, but unless you're the king, he probably didn't think so. But his remains were lost. No one was quite sure where he was buried. But in 2012, a skeleton that physically matched him was found under a parking lot. In fact, it was where they thought he should be. They dug and found him, I think, in a matter of hours. It was right where they expected it. They tested his mitochondrial DNA and his YDNA. And this was the family tree. So this is Richard III. He didn't have any direct descendants to test. So the mitochondrial DNA was through his sister, Anne of York. And if you think about it, they had to go through, this is something like 20 generations of maternal line. That's incredible, right? So they did this genealogy. These 13 and 15 represent generations. What they're essentially asking is, does the mitochondrial DNA of his sister's descendants match him? What's really nice about what they did is the distance here between these two lines. So if these two people match all by themselves, that confirms 15 generations of genealogical research. Miracle all in of itself, right? Then you're asking it also to match Richard III here. So they tested the mitochondrial DNA by testing descendants of Anne of York. When they did that, the mitochondrial DNA was, in fact, from one of these individuals, was a perfect match to Richard III's mitochondrial DNA. So that very, very, very strongly supported, and it was a relatively rare mitochondrial DNA, as I recall, so that very strongly supported their hypothesis that this skeleton was, in fact, Richard III. And they had a lot of other evidence to back it up, including some severe scoliosis, the battle wounds that fit descriptions, things like that. So this is an extreme example. If you're doing this with your mitochondrial DNA, I'd love to hear about it. I'm on a much smaller scale, but yes.
Did you hear about the Nancy Hanks story?
Yes, yep.
Because I think it's worth telling. I had to take Abraham Lincoln off my tree this week. It killed me.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have time at the end. We'll come back to that at the end. Because there's one more thing I want to talk about here with Richard III. So they tested his mitochondrial DNA, but they also wanted to test his YDNA. So, and it's also amazing that we're getting these samples from hundreds years old skeletons. But they couldn't find a closer male relative, so they had to go back to his great-grandfather here and work forward. So these are all males that are paternally related, or should be, to the skeleton. They all have the same paternal ancestry here, Richard III. So the skeleton and these individuals should have approximately the same YDNA. Now we know there's going to be some distance, right? So because YDNA changes faster, and there's a lot of distance here. But they should match. So they tested Richard III's mitochondrial DNA, and it was haplogroup G here. We don't care so much about this number, we can talk about that in another lecture. Haplogroup G. Just remember haplogroup G. They then tested these 5 individuals. Well, one of the 5 didn't match the others. So that's a problem. Because that is already showing you that this misattributed parentage or non-paternal events are a real occurrence. And they happen with greater frequency than we might suspect. So, I think there's a reason they don't provide these individuals' names, because by a process of elimination, I think you can figure out way too much about them. But these 4 individuals all matched each other. Now, one thing I'll point out is they're really only confirming back to here, right? Because that's where the branch point is here. Unlike this one, that branches all the way back to Catherine, because there's these 2 different lines. Here, there isn't that big diversity. What would be nice is to find another male descendant of John of Gaunt, for example, that works out here, or something like that. But this is the best they had at the time. They tested these 4 individuals, and they're in a completely different haplogroup. They're in haplogroup R1b. Now, based on all the evidence, the mitochondrial, the physical characteristics, he was right where he was supposed to be, they still concluded, even with statistical analysis, that it was a greater than a 99.99% probability that this was, in fact, Richard III. So what that means is, somewhere between here and here, there was a non-paternal event. Now, I think probably with when you're talking about a royal line, maybe that's not so surprising. There was an awful lot going on. It was a turbulent time, I think, to put it nicely. But that just goes to show you that YDNAs and mitochondrial DNA can be very, very powerful. They're not a cure-all. The mitochondrial DNA test by itself did not prove it was Richard III. It was a piece of evidence that they put into their overall hypothesis. So DNA, don't think of it as being the answer. It's part of the evidence you'll use when you're working with that. Yes?
Do you happen to know the mitochondrial haplogroup on Richard?
I don't remember off the top of my head, no. If you search the web for it, I'm sure it'll come up. Again, they confirmed with 99.9994% probability that it was in fact Richard III. Even though, and even factoring in the fact that the YDNA match. Because these YDNA misattributed parentage events occur at an appreciable rate. And that's why I also always recommend that people confirm these old lines when they can. Because it may not be that it comes out perfectly. Now, only test it if you're willing to accept, or you can accept the answer. If you've written the Williams family book, and you're 95 years old, and I would recommend you do a YDNA test, because it could be you spent the last 75 years on the wrong family. But just be prepared for the results that could happen. So I'm sure you have questions, and I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Yes? That sounds right. Oh, close! You're a distant relative of the king. Yes?
So these databases that they're comparing your DNA against, are they all part of this family tree DNA?
Yeah. So the question is, the databases, where are they? The databases you're being compared to will be at the company. So, for example, Family Tree DNA is really the company where you do mitochondrial DNA testing, so it's sort of their proprietary database. Now, there are some third-party tools. For example, there's a site called Mitosearch, and it's M-I-T-O search. So Mito for mitochondria, Mitosearch. Just do a Google search for Mitosearch, and it's also sponsored by Family Tree DNA, but it's more of a public site. And it used to be from about 2000 to 2010, there were many different companies doing mitochondrial DNA testing. And so a lot of people from these other companies have uploaded their results to Mitosearch. And it's really the only way, now that those companies are defunct, it's really the only way to compare to those individuals. So when you get your Mito results back, you're going to automatically see your matches at Family Tree DNA. But you can also try Mitosearch as well. There's also a site called YSearch. And that's spelled YSearch. And that's the same thing for YDNA. Because there was this short time, well, not short, it was a decade, where other companies were doing these tests as well. At the current time, however, the 99% of this testing is done in Family Tree DNA. Yes?
What about this business about finding Neanderthal?
So Neanderthal DNA, that's more from the autosomal DNA testing. So it turns out that it looks like once humans left Africa, those individuals that left Africa mated with Neanderthals. And so everyone who has non-African ancestry has a certain small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. And when you take a test at I believe it's 23andMe. Of the 3 big companies we'll talk about tomorrow, I think 23andMe is the one that reports a Neanderthal percentage.
What's the matter with the Neanderthals?
What's that?
What's the matter with the Neanderthals?
We wouldn't be here if it weren't for these Neanderthals. So, absolutely not. Yeah. Yes?
Is National Geographic still doing, like when I first considered doing it, National Geographic was now some sort of effort.
Well, National Geographic has the Genographic Project, and it's an incredibly valuable and productive project, but it's more of an academic project. It's not good for fishing for genetic relatives, for example, because you're not really matched up that way. It's doing a slightly different sort of test. However, if you're interested in learning absolutely everything you can about your YDNA and supporting an academic project like that, the Geographic Project is a great project. Because they are actually going out all over the world and testing indigenous people for their YDNA, mitochondrial DNA. And they do funding. They fund projects in these places where they do that. So it's a great project all around. You're not going to find any new relatives because of the geographic project, but it's an interesting project. Yes?
Can the family tree DNA material results be given to National Geographic?
They can go the other way. So your geographic project results can be transferred to family tree DNA. However, it's not the same type of test as what we talked about, so you're not going to be fishing for genetic relatives. But there's a chance you might get a discount on upgrading to that test. I can't remember. You might want to look at it. Yes?
Is there some way that maybe it's a personal test that's very expensive? But say I'm a female and I want to compare my autosomal genes to a surname where I don't have in my family. Is there some way of having the YDNA people in a surname project compare the whole autosomal?
Unfortunately, no. If you take an autosomal test, they don't test any of the Y. If you take a Y, they don't test any of the autosomal. So they're completely different tests. So you can't do any of that comparison. Not unless you have them do a test. One more question? Yes.
Family tree DNA has a big Y test.
Oh, big Y, yes. So, when we talked about YDNA today, we talked about STR markers, which are the markers you can use to calculate genetic distance and find relatives. There's another test called a SNP test. And what it does is it's looking at, those tests look at actually, instead of like 67 markers, 111, they look at thousands of positions along the Y chromosome for like a project like Big Y. However, those are older mutations, and they're more like the stable mutations we see with mitochondrial DNA. So they're not as good for finding relatives. What it's doing is, it's filling out more information in that haplogroup tree. Remember we saw that map where it emanated out of Africa and filled the rest of the world? Well, that's a high level. It used to be when you could actually plot that as a family tree. When Family Tree DNA had one of their early conferences, they had a poster. And it was one-page poster that had all the branches of the human YDNA tree. They could never do that now because it's reams long, because of projects like Big Y filling that in. So Big Y at the current time, I recommend it if you have a lot of money to spend and you want to help this project along. I've done Big Y and it hasn't really given me any new information. It just hasn't been useful for that. I like to think it's been my altruism has helped others, but for me it hasn't been too beneficial. Good question. All right, well thank you very much.